explained for further purposes.
It's going live.
Fantastic.
All right, fantastic. Without any further ado, I'd like to welcome the opening government team and the Prime Minister speaker. Here.
Everybody ready? Great. 3, 2, 1. Over the course of history, blood has been spilled by the buckets to know what it means to be right. We spill a drop for an eternity of truth. What does it mean to be a perfect moral actor? There are two scenarios in this debate. The first is that the motion presumes that there is an objective, perfect morality that an actor could follow, and everybody follows that same morality. There's a second one that might be sneaky to try to say, that there are simply different moralities that people follow, but each individual follows it perfectly according with their own set of morality or their own specific set of guidelines. Why do we win regardless of those two characterizations? Any morality at its perfect point largely coalesces around fundamental truths, no matter who it is written by, no matter which God you kneel to. Firstly, fairness. That is to say, every moral system would say that we are doing what we believe is right because it is fair. They would never say that we believe something to be unfair. Secondarily, they follow their morality because it is a better morality, not because they are biased. That is to say, they would say the reason I follow this morality is because I believe that it is the objective one. If you were to convince me one is better, I 100% would change my mind and follow it. What does this then mean for the round, and why is this strategic? That even if you define the motion as the latter scenario that I characterized, where it can be different moralities that each individual individually follows, people as perfect moral agents would have absolutely no bias and defer to a common morality nonetheless. That is to say, all moral systems have a fundamental rule, that is to say the golden rule, do unto others as what you would done unto you, or that they believe there is an objective morality that exists, that if they were able to have the answers and someone would convince them that is right, that they would follow it. Why does this then lead to a perfect world as we would describe it in opening government? One, people treat others exactly as they would want to be treated. And secondarily, this also funnels the first mechanism. They have perfect information as to how they would want to be treated in the shoes of another person, being that perfect moral agents. Why then would this short circuit any other analysis that could be given for why this means we get a perfect world? Because we might miss some mechanisms of how governmental systems might work, legal systems, religious changes, etc. CG might extend on why they win on utilitarian metrics and we get a perfect world. This mechanism will short circuit all of that. Largely, everyone has fundamental ways in which they would want to be treated. If one was poor, they would want to be taken care of. If one was to be accused of a crime, they would want sufficient due process. So while people might have different preferences and are unique beings, they want to have the same fundamental values treated amongst each other nonetheless. That is to say, everyone would say, I want to have honesty, I want to be treated with compassion and fairness. What are the impacts of this? Largely twofold. One, at the societal level, this looks like policies that people vote for, donations, charities, their individual actions that they take to fulfill this perfect moral system by any means in which they could or they believe is reasonable. Secondarily, on the individual level, the way they treat others, the way they lie, for example, to try to misbehave, the way they try to cheat on their partners and otherwise not do it in our world. So this applies at the societal level and the individual level to make people be treated as if they would want to be treated. Why then does this win us the debate? Primarily, the weighing metric you're going to use, or the way in which we win, is based on agency, which is a bit tricky because you would expect that opposition would try to win on agency and we would win on utilitarianism. This is going to win by their own metric. Firstly, for those that are dying, that is to say the people that we fundamentally inevitably kill, one, you free them from the shackles of life and suffering, but also a life in which they can never access their true preferences, where they never know what is correct. That is to say, note, there is no pain on our side. You die immediately by the wording of the Infoslide. The reason then you might say, but Ahmed, Why don't you just kill everyone and free them from life and suffering? Snap the finger like Thanos. Like, why don't we support genocide? Because the alternative world that we're creating is one that is otherwise never accessible in the counterfaction. It is a life in which everybody has the perfect understanding of what it means to be right, and they can shape their preferences about being a good person around those. So the reason we wouldn't commit a mass genocide is because we never have this kernel of truth that we could otherwise provide. Then, why is this legitimate? Because those who are dying would make this choice from a veil of ignorance. Why is this the case? One, the uncertainty of living life as an immoral actor or in a world filled with suffering compared to either the perfect life or an end for all potential suffering is one that they would choose. Why? Because on a cost-benefit calculus, no matter if they are risk-averse and they would want to hedge their bets, or they would want to take their gamble and try to maximize their life, they would choose this option. Because if you're risk-averse, you would say, yes, maybe on the off chance I might die, but at the very least you minimize any potential chance that I might suffer or live as an immoral agent that I otherwise never would have wanted to live. But if you're someone who isn't risk-averse, wants to get the bag as much as possible, take the risk, then obviously you would take this because you'd be in the 99%. Why is this the weighing metric you should use for this particular actor that opposition is going to say is the most important actor in this trial? All moral systems are created from the perspective of an individual and what they believe is fair and right, reflecting how they would like to be treated. So in other words, the weighing metric you should use for what choice should happen or how we should treat those that are the unlucky 1% is what would they do if they could have this choice from this veil of ignorance. I've proven to why it's more likely than not they would take this, and therefore, even if they might suffer, it is a risk that they would have taken themselves, making it legitimate. For those then that are alive, but before that, I'll take a bit away from back if I have anything.
Yeah, but I don't know how all of this is true if a supervillain is the one initiating it. Well, how do you trust the person?
I think people are complex beings, and even the worst among us can create the most beautiful things. That is to say, Matt is one of the most disgusting human beings that has ever existed, but he's given us probably some of the best mechanisms of I think that's sufficient. Now for those that are alive. One note, the reason that we maximize their agency is quite obvious. They are shackled by the doubt of being a good person, so they can never make choices that fulfill their preferences. But this is the really critical point, because this also applies, the second mechanism, to those that will be the unlucky 1%. They don't know their preferences under the world of law. People want to know what is right or wrong and ask for the right answer, but they can never find a guaranteed one, so we give it to them. They spend their whole lives up until their last breath not knowing if it was right or wrong. This then applies to every single actor in this motion. On side government, even if they are the ones that exist, they are shackled because they are controlled by preferences that they cannot validate or know or are ever certain to be theirs or the right one. In other words, when you weigh this debate, we would rather have people die on their deathbeds immediately, but knowing it was something which they are not shackled by preferences that they wondered if was ever right or wrong, or agency that they wondered should have been belonged to them.
Time.
I think it's quite clear that you should take this.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister Speaker for that fine speech. I'd like to thank the Prime Minister Speaker for that fine speech, and now welcome the opening opposition team and the leader of opposition speaker. Here. There's also a mic there if you want it. Against. There is a mic up there if you want it. That little.
Oh, I think that's probably a bad idea.
Just checking.
Yeah, no, thank you though. I really appreciate that. But just because I am so technologically incompetent, that could go badly. Sorry, hang on. The issue with this is, so I don't know if you've noticed, but as I lay out the sheets so that it continues, have a very black and white moral worldview. I'm probably one of the most morally judgmental people you will ever meet. So I specialize in moral philosophy. So I will view myself as having failed morally if I don't force you all to acknowledge that this is wrong. So if I'm a little nervous, it's not because of the debate, it's because my moral status is at stake. Okay. They would spill a river of blood for the absolute, to sell faith in our humanity, to sell who we are, to give up absolutely everything that makes us human, to deny people agency, to strip people of consent, to rob them of human dignity, to abnegate all of our responsibilities to each other, I have never been prouder to oppose. I'm going to forward 3 claims in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to broadly explain why the world is getting substantially better. Secondly, I'm going to explain why this strips us of the fundamental moral criteria that govern our value as human beings. And thirdly, I'm going to articulate how it strips us of the capacity to consent, the only thing and the only fundamental unit by which we mediate our relationships to each other and how we owe and what we owe. So firstly, on why this actually the world is getting substantially better. I think the first thing you have to notice, there's growing internationalism, which often means we're more likely to work together as a consequence of just shared interests in the recognition of external problems. Things like economic shocks, things like friggin' asteroids, things like climate change, which probably means there's more people working together. Secondly, norms of redistribution. A substantially larger number of welfare states are coming into being, and that means there's a greater expectation that they exist among the vast majority of people who are gaining power, fighting for them across the world, and that's likely to continue into the future. Thirdly, the spread of knowledge, meaning people are more aware of the fact that there is right and there is wrong through systems of education, through institutions like the internet that liberate people and allow them to think through things in a way that has never been possible before. Thirdly, technological change that liberates us from the constraints that we previously existed in through the largest number of researchers that has ever existed in the history of humanity in Harvard, in Yale, in Oxford, in Cambridge, that are literally working out how to end things like climate change and disease. And I think you have to notice the literal reality of this. We are at the lowest rate of war we have ever been at in history. We have the greatest redistribution of wealth in the history of humanity, and I think that indicates that things are getting a lot better and likely to get a lot better in the future. So the trade-off is not as simple. Why then does this violate the foundations of morality, right? Because the action that we are taking is so reprehensible, there is no justification for doing this. Right. The reason for this is because we're treating the entirety of humanity, every single person that exists, as a mere means. Not just a means, a mere means. Think about it like this. I can use all of you as a means, right? I can say, hey Umar, can I climb on your back to reach this apple? And you'll probably go, yeah, I'm using you as a means, right? But a mere means is different. That's reducing your status. That is stripping you of something that makes you fundamental. That's what we mean when we say we instrumentalize someone, right? It's to turn them into a tool, an object. Think about it like this. Imagine a person that comes in to rob a store at gunpoint, okay? There's a man, a quivering, old, scared man standing behind the desk, and I hold a gun to his face. And I say, if you don't give me your fucking money, I'm going to blow out your brains. That person is a monster and a piece of shit. Now imagine that same person does not see any difference between that action and robbing an ATM, robbing a vending machine. They don't think that person has any status greater than being a machine. Why does this matter? Because when we strip people of the capacity to make choices for themselves, to reason this out, to take in information, to respond as agents, as rich, virtuous human beings, full of potential, full of everything that makes us us, we reduce them to a mere instrument. We say, ah yes, there is an end, which is a world where everyone acts a particular way. We will strip you of everything that actually would make that end valuable by making you a mere tool to do it. Why is this the foundation of all morality? I think the first thing to note is that this has functionally infinite value, right? Imagine you're a person with a plethora of inner states, an incredibly unique experience that is unique to you, a whole variety of relationships to other people that have value and increasingly complex permutations, friends, lovers, family, all of those obligations have a kind of value. And at the core of that is the ability to reason, the ability to make choices on your own, the ability to opt in to the system and respond to them in a way that would allow for the alternative. When we strip someone of the ability to engage with or all of these different moral constraints, it's like forcing someone into doing forced labor. It's like putting a gun to your head and saying, ah yes, there might be greater returns from slavery, right? We might all be richer if there were slaves at the bottom of society, but it would be wrong to strip them of those other options and compel them to do it, even if it would be for our greater end. So you reduce their humanity and you say they don't have that complex from a value when you consign them to one. An obvious thing as well, panel, is moral value is not the only kind of value. There's pragmatic value, which means you might be prioritizing your self-interest. There are a variety of aesthetic values. People literally live Monks. There are religious values which aren't strictly moral. That means you rob everyone of the kind of value that exists within all those spheres and confine them ultimately to one. I think that is the greatest wrong you can do, because if you think about the scale of that, you strip the foundations of everything. No, thank you. Right, actually, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so psychologically speaking, how do you identify moral principles?
Yeah, that's actually an incredibly complex question, but I think the obvious thing in this world, right, is that all moral reasons would take an enormous priority to you. Probably you'd have a greater sensitivity to them, which would actually, and the point I'm going to get onto next, probably make your life a lot worse. Why then is this a violation of consent as well? I'm just going to say this really, really briefly, because I think what we have to acknowledge is none of these people know this, right? If I were to spike anyone in here's drink, you would think I was a complete monster. A, because consent is really important. Consent isn't just choice, right? We make choices all the time. What consent is about permission. And it's a fundamental power we have over ourselves to govern how we relate to each other. You get to do something to me if I give you permission, right? That's really foundational. We strip you of information. You don't get to make that choice. We strip you of agency. We control your body and literally direct it like a puppet on strings. All of these things, if you strip them of that power, consent is a form of power, right? It's a power we have over each other. And we don't know if there's some objective morality, some great God out there, but we do know we have each other. And we do know that we owe things to each other. So the greatest certainty in this debate is ultimately a regression to what we owe each other. If you violate consent, you violate the fundamental tenet by which we all relate and govern to each other, and that is just an absolute moral wrong. Now I'm going to just say one final thing, because I don't think, and this has been alluded to in my values thing, that you're just going to assume, oh, morality means a perfect actor, oh, it's going to be a perfect world. But note that you can be really, really, really moral and be unable to make the right decision. Because I think the world is getting better, but it'll probably never actually be perfect. Why? Even if you're a moral actor, there's an asymmetry of information, which means that you'll probably do things that are wrong and do things that are right because of conflicting data. Secondly, there are just things like blame and retribution, which might be drawn to their logical exclusion within a moral system that might harm other people. But I think most importantly, when you're in a world where there is likely to just be suffering, because there are things like resource constraints, there are things we can't control like mental health issues and all these things, if you feel like there are moral reasons you cannot act on the basis of, and you're substantially more sensitive to them, which is likely a fact of the world, millions upon billions of people will suffer constantly by seeing their moral failure, and I think that is probably an enormous moral harm. Oppose.
Thank you so much to the Leader of Opposition Speaker for that fine speech. We're now going to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case of the opening government. Is
this streaming live?
Yes.
Hi, Henry. No, we have never said that there is one perfect moral way, nor there is an objective good that will exist. And I think it's unfair when we take a much more charitable idea of what will happen. I think what we have tried to do in OG is say that the worst kinds of people, the people who are completely immoral, the people who go in and probably murder other people, commit acts like, oh, I don't know, being homophobic, transphobic, entirely misogynistic, the type of people who are likely to probably put a pill in a girl's drink, who don't follow through any moral framework, are the people who probably would cease to exist and their actions stop happening. We don't say that everyone will necessarily act perfectly, but we say that the people who act really bad all the time and inflict the worst harms upon people will stop doing so. Cool. I think when our leader of opposition tells us that the world is getting better and there's a shift towards the right and a utopia, I'm going to give you two responses. One of them is that the time that it takes to get to the perfect utopia they talk about is literally infinite, and through that process, you're letting hundreds of thousands of other people suffer for some end point that I'm not sure you get to. Reasons why you don't get to it, because of how the world is set up. Because there are a lot of people and there are not that many resources, but the resources are allocated randomly. I think this means through luck, I am born in a country that might not have access to oil or might not have access to oranges, and I might really like oranges. But there's a competition because people want oils and people might want oranges. Silly example, but people do want other goods. That means that competition naturally happens in the world, and it's unlikely you ever get to the utopia. It's also because my life is a massive birth lottery on their side of the house. I think they talk about a shift to the right. I could literally just be born in a war zone, right? I think if we are able to stop dictators and the worst people from occurring, I think the world gets marginally better, even if it doesn't get perfectly better, and it probably gets better in a way that would never happen unless you removed the worst of the worst actors, and you then don't spend as much time as they say. On the point about consent, right, and I think they say we violate people's consent. I don't think we violate people's consent, insofar as if I am in a pool and I'm drowning, you have consent, probably, while I have not directly consented to you performing CPR on me, you see me drowning, you see me dying, and you choose to resuscitate my body. You know that's something I would have wanted to do. I think me and Ahmed say that the world is dying, the world is drowning. Please, let us give you CPR, let us give you mouth to mouth, and let us resuscitate. Cool. I think then, why do we feel justified in stripping 1% of people's agency, right? I think even if they're best, if we do strip agency versus like the benefit of everyone else. No, thank you. I think no, there are cases that exist already in status quo where we limit people's agency and people's freedom, and like for the benefit of society as a whole. For example, I'm not allowed to drink my yaka and drive because there's a possibility, not a definite case, that I may injure someone else, right? I think this also means that note, I can't take any hard drugs in the UK because then I fund drug dealers and I fund cartels that are probably really bad for people's life, right? Even though it may not be direct, we still limit my agency, right? I think that the problem with the moral people, which I think OO needs to spend more time talking about how bad and conceding with how bad immoral people are. I'm not taking it. You have another speech to say. Is that immoral people don't value the lives of others. But what does that actually mean? What's the harm they have to stand over? If you don't value other people and you don't treat people like you yourself would want to be treated with a base level of kindness under most moral objective frameworks, I think it means that you treat others like shit. But not only do you treat others like shit, you treat others like shit in a way that stops them and limits their ability to access the agency that they talk about, right? I think that what does this look like? It looks like immoral CEOs that don't pay people living wages, that overwork them, which limits a whole working class people's agency because I'm not able to live my life and self-actualize if I'm bound to £5 an hour because I probably can't do anything meaningful from that, and my agency is stuck slaving under capitalism. I think immoral people look like people who are homophobic, racist, misogynistic, transphobic. These are people that spread hate actively, that stops other people's ability to freely live, to freely be themselves, and to freely access agency, right? I think this is like homophobic people that vote in shit politicians that literally stop my ability to decide whether I want to get married, how I want to express, and how I want to dress. I'll take the POR for close.
If people would really want this pair analysis, why don't you just ask them?
I think the reason that we don't ask them is because the bad people would always say, no, I don't want this, right? I think that if we, I think that we don't ask them because I'm a supervillain who probably can't afford to, I don't know, create a worldwide Wikipedia post. It's too expensive to have surveys. Cool. But also we don't ask them because, like, take the real reason I said why bad people say no. Don't take that shit. Okay, cool. Okay. If you choose to value agency, like side opposition has said, and you choose the side that gets the most agency, and you weigh this debate on that metric, even if you don't care about utilitarianism and you don't care about the benefits, we tell you we maximize agency on our side of the house because we tell you that the people who are immoral, who suffer, limit more people's agency than the 1% of people's agency and the 1% of people's consent that we strip away from them. So I think people's consent and agency get stripped either way. Bad speech, really sad. But only 1% on our side of the house, right? Whereas their side, you have the thousands currently suffering under systems and the infinite number that will continue to suffer under these systems, even if they get better eventually, which probably outweigh them. On to another bit now. But I tell you that people, I think we also tell you as well, people want to know what is right and what is wrong, right? And like, what is the objective truth? And I think that this really corresponds when Olo tells you that, like, when we take away people's choice, we take away what's inhumane. I'm saying right now, if your choice is to be bad and put another citizen at risk, you don't deserve that. You don't deserve that choice. that choice is not being humane. I think you should get to choose over other things in your life, but we can't let people make that choice. If so, we would live in a world that had no laws where I'd be allowed to murder my opposition, so I come first because I have the choice to do so, because that's what makes me humane. I don't think I have the choice to do so. I don't think that's what makes people humane. But I think ultimately, because we end suffering, we change the world. 1% of people in this room will die. Thank you for listening.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister Speaker for that fine speech, and now welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition to conclude the opening half of today's debate. Hear, hear.
Sorry, I have my sheets in the wrong order.
We good? And I just want you to realize what's at stake in this debate, because government have to stand over, firstly, killing 800 million people, secondly, denying everyone else of their agency and their fundamental capacity to make choices, thirdly, violating the consent of everyone who drinks water. These strike me as pretty big sums of suffering that we have to compare on our side. I'm firstly going to show you why the benefits they claim they get are actually relatively marginal. Secondly, I'm just going to justify to you the critical nature of the harms that are being committed on their side. The first thing I just want to deal with is the claim we get in the PM, which kind of annoyed me, which was to say that this is legitimate because behind the veil of ignorance, we would choose this. This argument is question-begging and circular, because the argument is we would choose this because it's good, and the reason it's good is because we would choose it behind the veil of ignorance. The debate is what decides whether behind the veil of ignorance you would choose it, so that can't be a metric for judging the debate. Then I want to talk about their claims. The first is that they say they will get a perfect world. Three responses to this. The first is that, as Caoimhin points out, this is a significantly more marginal contribution than it sounds, because it is true that there are bad things in the world. It is also true that there aren't that many of them, and that they are getting less and less over time. So the comparison between the two sides of this debate is not as large as Gov makes out, and you need to credit the absolute harms that we are bringing against them. The second thing I'd point out is that there are brute obstacles to the achievement of this perfect world. There is just not enough resources to give everyone a perfect life. There will always be trade-offs that need to be made. There are minimal moral harms that you have to commit, like stepping on bugs as you walk out of the house. All meaning that you are never going to get the absolute perfect world that they hinge the absolute benefit of their case on. The third thing I'd say is that there are just reasons to question that even if this were possible, we would get it. Firstly, as Caoimhin points out, it is not often clear that a moral approach to a situation is the one that leads to the best end outcome. Secondly, this has been created by a supervillain. I would posit it is likely that they don't have the best conception of morality that the world would want. Thirdly, there is no justification in the Infoslide or in OG's arguments that this is hereditary, so the generation after the ones who have drank this water probably mightn't be as moral as they think. I think there is a very small comparison in terms of the actual change in morality on their side. The second claim they have is that even if they don't get a perfect world, they at least reduce uncertainty about morality. Firstly, I just question how big a deal this is. I don't think most of us are pained and in anguish all the time because we're uncertain about our moral obligations. Secondly, though, I would note that you have to compare this to the moral anguish that Caoimhin points out definitely would happen in a world of perfect moral actors that are aware of all the moral things that they can't do. Thirdly, I would note that they necessarily have to commit a moral harm on their side. They then create a world where everyone cares a huge amount about morality. I'd posit those people would be very upset about the fact that they just killed 800 million people. So if this debate is about the feelings of the people in the world, I think that is much worse on our side of the house. The final claim that exists in opening government is that somehow they help the agency even of the people they kill. My first response to this is just like, that is not what words mean. You cannot say you give people agency by killing them. That is taking away their agency because they're dead. Secondly, their other justification is that you no longer have uncertainty, so you can be a more agentic being. Again, this is the opposite of what agency is, because if it's certain what you have to do and you're forced to do it, you're not exercising any agency because you're not choosing between options. Agency requires uncertainty, and uncertainty is a moral good insofar as it gives us the power to exercise our will and actually be human beings and actually experience our dignity. Onto why the harms are so great. I just want to point out that you cannot judge this debate on utilitarianism as government have conceded. Because in all of the really powerful analysis they give us about the suffering it has in the world, they use the moral language that underlies our case. In the deputy, we hear that you are taking away the agency from people when you go out and you drug them. In the prime minister, you hear that we are inflicting suffering by having rivers of blood as we kill individuals. Government themselves have conceded that there is a value to agency, there is a value to human dignity, that it is not just a number-crunching activity. I'd note also that while it is true that in the current world people have their agencies denied, clearly not everyone has their agency denied, and clearly not everyone experiences harms. It is certain on their side of the house that every single person in the world has the moral harms that we have outlined committed against them. They are either murdered or they have their free agency taken away from them. They are used as mere instruments in the creation of a perfect moral world. They are denied the human status of being able to make reasoned decisions and think for yourselves. It is a certain harm that happens to every single person in the world versus speculative harms that happen to some but not all people in the world. So the calculus in this debate isn't between a world of perfect morality and a world of imperfect morality. Is instead between two worlds where different sets of harms are being committed, but on their side, the harms are vastly more extensive. Before I go on to the other harms that are being committed, supplementary to this, closing.
So, at what point in human evolution, from a single cell, did a random set of biological and chemical reactions become able to objectively identify the good in a verifiable way?
So, I don't really understand what you're driving towards here, because if your point is that there's no morality, then drinking this would be even more meaningless, we'd just be killing 800 million people. If your point is that we give these individuals a morality that is not something that humans care about, I don't understand why that is good. I don't see the benefit of this PMI. Secondly, I just note, and I really want to nail this, how big a harm it is to kill 800 million people. You are taking away the most fundamental good that exists, which is just life, because everything else hinges on that. But I'd also note that even if government want to claim that it's acceptable because in the end we get lots of good things, that is never a reason to do something as fundamental as murder. Because your claim is, I want to achieve something good, so what I should do is take away the most fundamental good-giving thing of an arbitrary person. That is never acceptable to instrumentalize that one individual for the sake of others. Because there is no way government could possibly make this calculus in a fair way. They could never justify why this group of people are the ones that we've taken life away from. Why this group of people are the ones that we have decided are lesser and less important and are not deserving of our moral judgment. So you create harm to those individuals, but you also morally harm yourself. Because you are the one making this decision, and you do it in a way that strips those individuals of agency. The final thing I want to point out is just the lack of consent. And opening up government try to say that this is fine because this will be in individuals' interests. I know, firstly, you can consent to things that are not in your interest. That is not a justification for taking away people's consent. Secondly, what's at issue in this debate is the very fact of it being in their interest. Thirdly, having that consent taken away from you is itself something that goes against your interest. Because what it does is it strips you of an ability to have your own will protected and to give the permission for other things to happen, which is the core power that is vested in all human beings. That is what's at issue. It's not whether or not doing this for the person would be good or whether they would choose it in some hypothetical world. It's the fact that they didn't choose this and you are forcing it upon them. On-site government, they force cruelty and lack of agency on every human being. They kill 800 more, and it's not even clear what benefits they get. I am exceptionally proud to oppose this motion.
Thank you so much to the Deputy Leader of Opposition Speaker for that fine speech. I'm now going to welcome the closing government team and the Member of Government Speaker. Here.
3, 2, 1, go. Our understanding of morality is limited and often wrong. It is based on limited experiences that we have in life, and we only see a small window to the world. It is based and skewed by our emotions, and importantly, above all else, it's skewed by our own evolution, noting most animals act in completely different moral ways. Under this motion, there is an objective morality, and we can make people follow that objective morality. As our information to understand morality is so small, the morality that we follow is likely wrong and likely incorrect. This explains, and I'll do this in my speech in the analysis, this explains why under the status quo, we are likely to follow incorrect morality. Note, we will take it over opening government, because that even though they say that in our world we will live in a perfect morality, they don't explain why the status quo is a bad morality. That is, they explain we'll live in a perfect morality, and we agree with that, but they don't explain how big of an impact it is, because they're not comparative to the status quo, because they don't explain how bad morality is under the status quo. We'll fill in this gap and take it over them. We're taking over opening opposition because we actually just completely rebut their case, because their case is purely based on our intuitions as a human, and our intuitions which are based on our limited experiences and our limited understanding and our evolution. Note, when they talk about the things that they learned in their philosophy degree, they talk about the things that they've learned as philosophers, spending hundreds of years doing these things with relatively little understanding and haven't gotten very far, which is why we still need to research it even now, and Keerthana will probably get nowhere in his PhD, because no PhD students get anywhere. Like being serious, all the stuff they say to do with like how we'll teach others, etc., I'll get to this at the end, how we teach others, how we have a welfare state, is based on our limited understandings under the status quo. The same with all the things such as limiting autonomy, etc. Okay, note then, what are our mechanisms for why it is the case that you just have limited ability to rationally understand morality in the status quo, and our morality is bad? 3 reasons why this is the case. The evolution one's the most important, but all of them stand. Firstly, we just have limited experiences in life. We see a tiny view of the world in our lives. We see relatively few things, and those things are mostly things that are like us. We mostly socialise with people who are like us, or because we are influenced by our situations and our environment around us, but also everyone else that we're around is also influenced by the exact same environment, so we are often just only exposed to the exact same people, the exact same things, and the exact same morality over and over again, so just do not have the opportunities to learn any sort of objective morality. Secondly, our emotions. When people think of emotions, they rely, so when people think of ethics, they rely on their emotions. Does this feel bad? Does this feel good? Note that as I'll get onto, those are based on primarily just evolution, but also as well, these are often just not very good indicators of whether something is actually moral or not. They're not logical, they're not rational, they're based on things that how you feel in the moment, and are not therefore based on actually what is likely to be objectively correct later. Okay, thirdly, and importantly, on evolution. Note, the way in which we have evolved is somewhat arbitrary. And I want to be very clear with some intuitions here. Most animals are not like humans and have extremely different morality. Like, most animals live solitary lives, not in communities, and they kill each other at first sight. Most lions, most tigers, most big cats, etc., when they see other members of their own species, will kill them and destroy them because they see them as a threat to them and will have no qualms or obsess about doing that. Also at the same time, there's bugs that literally eat, like, I think it's the locust, where the female literally eats the male's head after sex. Note, like, obviously this seems unintuitive as humans that this is not moral, but it does seem to the bloody animal that it's moral because this is what they follow and what they follow. Note, our evolution is relatively arbitrary. We've evolved to be in this way because of the situation that we are in. It is not because of what is morally correct, and we have not formed a society and our own intuitions based on what we find to be morally correct. We're based on what survives the most. That is, when people, when humans, for example, who cared for themselves and were somewhat selfish, survived better because they were somewhat selfish and kept food for themselves, etc. They survived better and passed their genes on to the next generation, or more likely to pass their genes to the next generation, and were therefore the ones that are more likely to survive, and the future generations were likely to be selfish. As humans, we also care about other people to some degree. We care about, there's a balance between selfishness and other people. The reason why I care about other people is because, like, if you care about other people, maybe they'll help you find food, etc. And there's benefits of doing that. So those people are also more likely to survive and pass on their genes. No, that means we just come to like an arbitrary moral code where we care about our selfishness and our own morals to some degree, but we also care about the morals of other people to some degree. And that balance is purely based on human society. And as I gave you my intuition points at the beginning, it's likely other species have evolved in a completely different arbitrary way, and we are no more objective than them. Okay. No, okay. I'll also give some solipsism analysis, because apparently solipsism is good. No, that also just fundamentally we are limited. Note, our own understanding of the environment and the world that we see around us is purely based on our senses and how we experience the world. Note that these senses are unreliable for all the analysis I just gave you, but also because of the fact they're our only window into the world, and we don't fully understand how these things work. Note then as well that, because of that, we only have an incorrect understanding of the world, or understanding of the world which is not objective, and we can only see within our own heads. What this means is it means that we cannot ascribe an objective morality because we don't know an objective morality, because we only know our own thoughts within our own heads. I'll take over.
So ignoring the fact that the value is highly speculative, if all of my other capacities, physical, etc., remain exactly the same, you've just created a standard that no human likely will ever be able to reach. So
I have a response to that. Even if no human can reach that standard, this is objectively correct. This is how people should live their lives, and they have a moral harm under their side of the house, because what we're doing in the status quo is likely harming people morally. If this is morally correct, what we're doing on the side of the house, this is objectively correct, just simply by the fear of the motion that we're following objective morality. Note, why is this beats opening opposition, opening government? I've explained why it beats opening government. Because opening government explains why we have a perfect morality on our side of the house, but not why the status quo is a bad morality. We show the impact of their case, we show why the status quo the morality is likely to be bad, and now why it is likely to be better. We beat opening opposition though, because when they talk about all these things, they are based solely on our intuitions as a human. Look, the first thing they talk about is stuff to do with education, stuff to do with the welfare state, etc. This is likely to be wrong because it's based on our own understanding of morality, which is poor because of all the analysis that I have given you. When they talk about it robbing you of your agency, when they talk about it potentially harming some individuals, note, we do not know necessarily whether these things are correct. These things are just purely, let's be very clear, their analysis to these things was based on intuition, that we only understand as humans because of this understanding that we have based on our evolution, based on our psychology. They may not necessarily be morally correct, and we do not know. This is exactly the same with killing other people. Note that this is a contentious issue even in society. Often we do, for example, mandate vaccines which could potentially have side effects, potentially kill people. We often think of just wars which end up killing people. It is not always it's an open moral question whether it's the right to kill other people to save others. Note, we solve the open moral question on our side of the house, and whichever answer we get to the open moral question is the right answer because it is objective morality. Note, their side of the house, just like the status quo, they're probably harming everyone in the world really badly morally. We have objective morality, and we're actually following what is right under our side.
Thank you so much to the Member of Government Speaker for that fine speech. We're now going to call upon the Member of Opposition to begin the closing opposition side. Hear, hear.
Gov is contingent on the idea that every decision people make is exclusively or primarily dictated by their moral intuitions. Nowhere on either team do they prove that this is the case for the vast majority of individuals, and I think that is why they immediately lose the debate. But I'm going to be a little bit more engaging. As per Ahmed's own analysis, people are complex moral beings, and they have complex intuitions. That's the response he gave to Erasmus's POI. Here's the problem. You as a complex individual, a complex person with different moral frameworks, can have a very clear moral framework and very clear moral intuitions. But when you're faced with particular circumstances, you may act in ways that are not consistent with that moral framework. We see this in the status quo. A hungry Ukrainian mother that is a perfect moral actor that has never hurt an insect in her life and would never think of hurting another person might be put in a situation where she has to choose between the safety of her kids and hurting a Russian soldier. She might not morally believe that it is good to harm another person, but in that instance she's going to still act in that way because there are other things that inform the decisions that she makes. That is why it is untrue that either team on Gov's side solves other decision-making processes of individuals, and even if everyone is a perfect moral actor, they do not prove that they guarantee individuals always act in ways that have good externalities for other people. The first thing I want to do is explain that the burden on GovBench was to explain that even if we are 100% certain that Nietex functions in precisely the way that the supervillain says it does, that the mechanism for administrating Nietex ought to be contaminating people's drinking supply without their knowledge. The first thing I want to note is even if you buy that Nietex is a good thing, I'm going to explain why it probably doesn't function in the way that they assume that it does. There are several other ways in which we can administer it to people. You can make it an option in the same way we don't force people to take vaccines. CG asserts that this is how we do. I think the vast majority of countries don't force you to take a vaccine. They tell you what it does. They say why you should consider it. They explain to you why it might be a good thing for you to do. They don't force you to take it, and they don't stab you when you go in for a blood test. That's exactly what they're telling you should do on their side. Why can't it be optional? Why is it absolutely necessary that it has to be administered to everyone without their consent? The thing I want you to note that explicitly beats OG on this is the very fact that the government admits that they have to do it without the consent or knowledge of individuals means they admit that individuals would not opt into this themselves. That is probably not something that fits within the preferences and agency of constituents. I'm going to do a little bit of world building from CO, so this finals is a little bit more fun. No one in opening half explains why the way we are told retired supervillain Dr. Apocalypse has told the government Nietex functions, like the way that Nietex functions, is likely to be the precise way in which Nietex functions. Note, you can laugh at this, but it wouldn't be part of the Infoslide if it wasn't in some capacity relevant to the debate. No, I don't have to prove that the doctor did lie. I have to prove that there is a significant chance that he did lie. And knowing that there is a significant chance, if the government makes the decision to risk the 1% death without a 100% certainty that Nietex will function and manifest all the benefits they assert it will benefit, it is a particularly egregious moral harm on the part of the government, and that's why it's a bad thing. Why is there a meaningful risk that the doctor has not made Nietex to make people perfect moral beings? I'm going to be honest, his name is Dr. Apocalypse. His life goal probably wasn't creating a utopia with rainbows, unicorns, and moral actors. He probably valued creating chaos and destruction within society. But the second is, OG just didn't set it up. We don't know how the government acquired Nietex, so I'm going to engage in either of the ways they might have done it. The first is, they found it in his lab, in their lab in one of the times they raided it. I, again, don't think that they were spending time making things that are going to make the society better in their free time, so anything they find in their lab probably doesn't meet this end goal. Which means that even if they then question the doctor, they can lie and say that this is what it does, so that it gets administered to people, and then they get the outcomes of creating chaos and damage to society. The second is, if the doctor is retired and then made the compound for the government, all the incentives I've pointed out before means that it is probably likely that they have lied about what it does, so that the government administers it to people and does something that is morally bad and does something that creates chaos. Here are the impacts. The first is, the effects of Nietex could be very different from what we've currently been told they are. Maybe 2% of people are allergic. Maybe the effect wears off after a week. Maybe it turns people into Shrek. It means that there are significant reasons to believe that we aren't 100% sure that Nietex functions in the way that Gov's case is contingent on it functioning, which makes on our side from CO exclusively all the moral harms that OO gives you significantly worse. Because if you believe that instrumentalizing people is bad, instrumentalizing people when you don't have certainty of the good outcomes you are using them as a means to is especially and significantly more bad. That is the weighing against OO. I want to note that this is the assumption that all of their impacts is contingent on Ahmed.
The reason it must be forced is the same reason vaccines had to, because shitty people want to be shitty. I trust the panel to know that the Infoslide operates as given in the Infoslide.
Okay, second, notions of morality change over time. You didn't set this up, my guy. Okay, we become better moral actors when we are able to have discussions and interrogate whether actions are or are not moral. This is how we have arrived at the moral frameworks we currently have, because we have interrogated actions that have occurred throughout history and questioned whether they are or are not moral actors, which is why we have arrived at the frameworks we currently enforce upon people. Here's why this is important. The illustration is 100 years ago, it was morally permissible, and you were a morally perfect actor, even if you used others as slaves, even if you colonized another country, because you were a greater moral being, and that was your moral duty to do that. What this illustrates to you is an entire society could believe that they are acting in perfectly moral ways, but their actions have externalities to other individuals that still cause negative implications. This is important for two reasons. The first is, even assuming there is currently objective morality, this is the metric or standard of morality that we currently apply to current members of society. The problem and the change that we mitigate from our side is 20 years down the line, the type of moral frameworks or what it means to be a morally perfect person could be vastly different. But if individuals are still acting on the basis that objectively perfect moral beings is what the standard is today, you no longer have that discussion, you no longer have the interrogation process that allows you to arrive at conclusions about what it means to be a good moral person and hold individuals to that standard in the future. Our case is very, very simple. First, we force you to question the assumption that Gov relies on, which is that it definitely functions in this way. We explain why the risk is not worth taking, and especially bad to instrumentalize people when you are not 100% sure that the good outcome is going to be achieved. For all those reasons, CO.
Thank you so much to the member of opposition speaker for that fine speech. We're now going to move to welcome the government whip to conclude not only closing government side, but indeed the government bench. Get here.
fell for Joseph Lewis's bait, which is that the motion very clearly says that it functions in this way. If you contradict that, you lose. It doesn't say that he says this; it says that it functions in this way. Therefore, you lose. I think the rest of the substantive is just like not enough on account of the fact that your whole case relies on contradicting the Infoslide. Anyway. Panel, I think we've given you something very important in this debate, right? Which is that this motion requires the existence of objective morality when we in the status quo are currently unable to identify any, right? I currently believe that morality is subjective, precisely because I'm unable to identify any objective moral principles, right? And I think that our moral senses are basically arbitrary chemical reactions as facets of biology, right? But this motion, notably, requires that morality is objective, because there is no such thing as acting as a perfect moral actor if, morality is not actually an objective facet of the universe. And because we've now, the analysis that my partner gives you identifies morality as an objective facet of the universe, we win this debate. We're going to spend actually probably spend most of the case responding to O, right? So first of all, how do we reply to O, right? So first of all, I think that all of the principles that OO claims to believe in are basically human-centric, and they rely on a human perception of the world, right? But the key thing that my partner tells you about these perceptions of the world is that the way in which they came to be are contingent on morally arbitrary factors. That is to say that there was never an aspect of morality that was involved in the creation of those moral principles. Now, this is not what humans like to believe. We like to believe that our principles are grounded in objective truth, and certainly, I'm sure Keevan would be very upset if he found that his were not. But I think that this is simply the case, right? And you can see this is true in a few ways. It's for the reason my partner tells you, right? So what OO makes, right, is basically a Pascal's wager of morality, right? Where they say like, if you do this, you will you risk committing an infinite harm, and for that reason there is no amount of moral volume in a consequentialist sense that could outweigh this infinite moral value, right? But this is the same kind of thing that theologians say when they say, you should believe in God, because if you believe in God and there's a God, you get infinite utility. If you don't believe in God and there's a God, you get infinite harm. And on the other side, there's no benefit either way, so it's better to always believe in God. But the simple rebuttal to this case, right, is to say that if there is, in fact, a God out there, we don't necessarily have the sort of a priori access to know what that specific God, or the good in this case, is actually likely to be, right? And so the missing link in their case, and the reason that we come sort of analytically prior to them and beat them on that basis, right, is that we take them at their sort of moral foundations within this debate, right? We take them when they say instrumentalization is wrong. I think that is irreparably coloured by the things that they believe and the experiences that they have had from birth and the way that morality has evolved over the course of human development. I'll take the POI.
Debates are judged by the average intelligent voter. Burdens exist, so you have to literally overturn consent for this to work perfectly wrong. Your argument only shows that evolution could track to an imperfect type of morality, not that it doesn't. By your own logic.
Yeah, no. This is only half the battle, right? Because the specific thing, the specific flaw with the Pascal's wager, right, and the reason that this response is insufficient, right, is because the configurations of morality that we have as humans are essentially random. And the reason that they are essentially random is we are distributed on a random piece of rock within the universe. And the way that humans evolved is necessarily coloured by the type of environment we grew up in, our sort of access to certain resources, and therefore the traits that would be selected for, and therefore the biology that would cause you to believe certain principles is contingent on this. What Matt tells you is that the principles of cooperation and treating others how they want to be treated and all the cool things that they say were beneficial evolutionary mechanisms, and the reason that they were beneficial is because they help us coexist with our fellow man. And so the individuals that did that were able to better coexist with their fellow man, and thus they became more likely to survive. But the key thing is that survival is in and of itself arbitrary, in that we are just sort of random collections of atoms and consequential chemical and physical and biological reactions that occurred to maybe the Big Bang or something that we don't yet understand, right? And so what we really change in this debate, right, is that we inject objectively the good into something that has previously never ever been exposed to it. And that is a magnificent benefit on our side of the house. We're not just saying that their benefits are small. We're not just saying we're mitigatory. We're saying that they have not, if they have identified any moral values, they have done so purely by chance. And I think that on intuition, there are such a large number of random configurations of morality, the actual chance that those random configurations that they have selected through arbitrary conditions to be correct is an incredibly, incredibly small number. I'll take a second.
So you admit that no one in the world cares about this imagined objective morality. So even if you give this
Right.
to everyone, why is that good?
That's good because it is the good. It is objectively good, right? This is like this house believes that motion, right? Which is to say that like we are trying to identify what is good in the world, and sort of the motion and Infoslide gives us like a priori good, that we are definitely acting as a moral actor, and that we have absolute certainty that we are doing so sort of in this situation, right? The reason that I think that we beat kind of OG, right, is that they rely on, I think, very similar premises to OO on the same basis, right? Because they talk about, get up and talk about like fundamental truths of the university, talk about the golden rule and fairness and so on. And I think in the same way that we do to OO, we unanchor those principles from the intuitions that they rely on and show why they are simple, arbitrary chemical reactions, right? And finally, then, I think the best case on their side is to say, but we get a priori moral knowledge because we do not need to know anything outside of our own mind or in order to identify things, we only require the existence of our own mind. Why is this not true, right? I think the first thing, right, is that if we are born with no understanding of the world, and we get literally no stimulus, then we will never learn. We will never evolve. We will never, learn to comprehend, formalized logic, because we require externalities as humans, right? Which means that if we are reasoning about these things, then our moral principles must have been colored by externalities. It must have been colored by our senses, which we know we cannot rely on. And it is therefore that all of the things that we believe as human beings are inseparable from our senses. So the only role of our mind, from an evolutionary perspective, is to comprehend the information that we retrieve through our senses, but our senses are insufficient to ever identify a single objective moral principle. What we do on this debate is we bring you objective morality, we bring you the universal identification of that objective morality, and we win the debate on those absolutely magnificent harms I have never been prouder to propose. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to the government group speaker for that fine speech. We're now going to welcome the opposition group to conclude the closing opposition team and indeed the debate. Yeah.
Yeah, just to flag, I brought yaka instead of water. And I just want to say, Uma, if you have brought this earlier, I probably would have broken first. Alright, shout outs to Shoya. I don't know, I didn't consent to this, but he asked me to shout outs to him. So. Which will probably prove why Gav's case is not bad. I'll get to it. Sorry, second. Cool. I'll take POIs in my 5th minute, and I know it's a final, so I'll give Ahmed and Hilary a chance. I'm going to start off this debate by weighing against opening opposition out of respect for the fact that they broke perfect. The very first thing I want to be able to clear out is that in some instances, we do agree that agency can be perverted, that agency can be subjugated in order to produce a moral good. The difference in here is that the kind of moral good that is produced, or at any point in time when you reduce the agency, because of the gravity of the decision that you're making, you need to be able to produce certain moral outcomes. So the burden here, simple burden for Gav, is to be able to prove that there is a certain moral outcome which they essentially need to defend. The strategy from opening opposition, and as much as I respect their philosophy, is to say that consent is universal and consent in itself is the most appropriate thing to do. They spend literally a minute telling you why these moral outcomes are not certain. I'll list them, I have time. One, they use a supervillain example, which I flagged in the POI, not too honorable. Secondly, they say the next generation won't have that. The whole room laughed, I left it to you. They say that moral actors in themselves do not produce no moral outcomes. zero analysis. And I know I'm probably here, but when I see zero analysis, I can see zero analysis, and I expect the panel to be able to do so. And that is where we clearly take the debate, because my whip speech is very simple, and I'm casual because it is the only thing that we need to do to be able to prove that in as much as consent and agency in itself is instrumental, there is no production of certain outcomes from their side, and therefore we should not take the risk of doing this. Cool. Consent and agency. Why is it first thing I'll notice about this is it is instrumental, because this is the means by which we are able to access benefits throughout the world. How is it instrumental in this instance? We trade off our agency to the state in order to produce certain outcomes from the state. So we give them taxation, our money, we give them ourselves, they limit our movement, our freedoms, all in the certainty of the outcome that they can't be able to provide us. And that's how come in some instances when they do not provide it, you are able to protest, you're able to send them to the court of law and sue them, because the basis of that is the certainty of those very outcomes. It is also the biggest measure to be able to fulfill self-fulfillment, and therefore it is prized in the way in which it is, and we can also trade it off in some instances. So in the instances where clear consent, in the instances where you can't express consent clearly, that should be prioritized in every instance. So for example, and trigger warning over here, if you're having sexual relations with your opposite sex or sexual relations with another person, it is unjustifiable to be able to interpret their actions as consent when you can explicitly ask them. So I want you to just gut check this. It smells of perversion and of bad incentives if you say so. So I don't care about Matt's beautiful analysis on how like people, you can determine when they are dead and all those nasty things. You can literally ask them. You not asking them cast doubts over your intent, and that in itself undermines every other decision that you take. The best response they have to this is to say that, well, bad people will disagree. I'm unsure why that is bad, because then you are judging them on a sin that they have not committed, and you are taking this particular action against the large majority of people that you say would agree. But secondly, if the majority would agree anyway, then you still get your massive moral outcomes, and the others probably commit a crime and probably go to jail, and you still get the kind of world that you have. There is no justification for the overriding consent. The strategic implication of this argument is that it takes away a lot of OO's analysis around consent and agency being the principal thing out in the world, because it truly is not. And that's where they spend most of their analysis. So if you are being fair, that is where we beat them, because they have proven something that, I don't know, doesn't really matter within this debate. But secondly, we showed you why you do not get perfect morality on their side, but secondly, how you improve morality on our side. Because also, OO says that the kind of morality that you have in the world is being influenced by technology, AI, and some other things. I'm unsure how that is improving morality. Name one app that is improving morality. I don't know. But why don't you get imperfect morality on their side? Because one, there is no objective morality. Morality in itself is socially agreed at different points in time. And I know, I'm coming to you. I don't know why perfect information exists, because that is their only mechanism to be able to say that morality would change and people would opt into this, because we can assume they have perfect information. Then they say the basis of this is a principle of fairness. But I will contend, fairness is a modern evolution and predates every other moral society, which means that there was a point at which people felt they were moral, but there was no existence of fairness until John Rawls, which means that I'm unsure why fairness becomes the static objective thing to be able to rule morality all over the centuries which we would have. Secondly, that is not the principle of fairness, but the interpretation of fairness is what dictates morality in most instances. So in some instances, so example, if I find gold, or if you find gold on a land which someone has leased to you, is it fair that you take it, or is it fair that you return it to the owner? It always depends on the discussion in principle. But even if it is perfect, why does it stifle morality? Before I go on, OG.
Choices that are immoral are not inalienable. In the same way we have laws to take away those choices, everyone in society consents to, and if they don't consent, we still imprison them and recognize that as legitimate.
Yeah, I'm fine with that. That's what was his. Why it stifles progress in morality? And no, that's very important. Because the whole point of progress in morality relies on the fallibility and the ambiguity which is attached to morality. Why don't you get that in their world? Because there's a perception of a certainty in our moral position. Hey, we have drunk the water. Why are you saying we are bad? We have drunk the water. We are perfect moral beings. Anything that we are doing, anything that we are producing is one that is coming out of perfection. So this defeats their specific mechanism of saying you have the ability to opt out of it into a higher morality, because there is no other higher morality which you are willing to be able to agree which precedes the one which you have. I don't know where that necessarily comes out from. But why is this necessary? Because morality at every point is a consensus. Is it right to kill the soldier, or is it right to protect the life of your daughter? And it depends on the situation and circumstances. So for example, when we had mandatory lockdowns, it is silly to have mandatory lockdowns when nothing is happening. But when COVID happened, it became one that was legitimate. Two, because of our inability to predict all scenarios. So he fears perfect information, but we don't know. Like, for example, the creation of AI, which has tipped the balance and the discussion on ethics. We are unable to determine why that will happen. So this is what essentially makes our morality better, because it allows us to discuss the blind spots of society, of the legitimate limitations of the other influences that limit our moral outcome. So this water does not influence those other things. It just makes us a moral actor who is perfectly aware of what is right and wrong, and that also defeats CG's case. But secondly, because it helps us to adapt to the situation, because the most moral outcome is not always the best outcome. For example, lockdowns which limit agency and freedoms. At the point where we make the moral decision, we can produce bad outcomes economically, politically, socially, and I'm not sure why we should always prioritize that. At different points where there are different intuitions which act on within the moral actor, I'm unsure why morality is always the lever by which we act, and why moral outcomes are the ones we should prioritize.
I'd like to thank the opposition speaker for that fine debate, and once again congratulate all of the speakers for what was an incredible final. We will move to deliberate now. Thank you.